The book of Ruth is a very beautiful story, but lacks any religious content whatsoever. It brings no spiritual or legal addition to our understanding. It was written by the prophet Samuel, by Shmuel Hanavi, but it has no legal value, and we wonder, why did the holy prophet Shmuel, whose yahrzeit was just a couple days ago, why would he have written the book of Ruth? And even more importantly, why was it deemed necessary by the sages to incorporate this book inside of the Torah, inside of the Tanakh? What's so great about the book of Ruth? And that's what tonight's discussion is all about. The book of Ruth, its meaning, and its unique and extraordinary connection, the profound depth within it. Its connection to the festival of Shavuot, which is why it's a Jewish custom amongst many, many communities to read the book of Ruth during the Yontiv of Shavuot. The story of Ruth is a story about 3,000 years ago, when there was a famine in the land of Israel, and a leader amongst the people of Israel, his name was Elimelech, was a wealthy man. During this famine, he did not want people to line up at his door trying to share his fortune. He didn't want beggars at his door, so he decided to skip town. Together with his wife, Elimelech, and Naomi, his wife, and his two sons, Machlon and Kilion, they went over to the land of Moab, which is today modern-day Jordan, the other side of the Dead Sea. There, he escapes his people, and they descend to the point where the two sons, Machlon and Kilion, marry two Moabite princesses. They were two sisters, Orpah and Ruth. These two, Orpah and Ruth, were actually granddaughters of a king by the name of Eglon, king of Moab, who made great troubles for the people of Israel, who he in turn was a grandson of one of the nemesis of our people, mentioned in the Bible, the King Balak. King Balak, there's an entire Torah portion dedicated to his name about when Balak tried to hire Bilam to curse the Jewish people and how that story ended up. So here they are, Elimelech and his wife Naomi and their two sons are in the land of Moab. Their two sons marry these two Moabite princesses. And as the story continues, Elimelech passes away, as well as his two sons. Now Naomi is a widow with her only two daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth. By the way, Oprah was named for Orpah. I believe her mother was unsure of the exact name Orpah, so she changed it to Oprah. But Orpah and Ruth are now walking back to the land of Israel with their mother-in-law Naomi. Naomi says to them, "What do you need to come back with me? I'm just a miserable widow. I really have nothing. I'm coming back with the tail between my legs. But you two, you have your whole lives ahead of you. You can remarry. You can build for yourselves new families. You have your whole future ahead of you." And indeed, Orpah returns back to Moab. She ultimately becomes the great-grandmother of Goliath, whereas Ruth recites the timeless words of commitment to her mother-in-law Naomi. She says, "Entreat me not to leave thee, and to return from following after thee. For wherever you go, I will go. Where you sleep, I will sleep. Your people are my people. Your God is my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. The Lord should do the same to me, and more also, if anything but death should separate us." And this is the words of conversion that Ruth says when she accepts upon herself the God of Naomi as her God, and she sticks with her mother-in-law. She remains loyal and committed to her mother-in-law. She returns to the land of Israel. The book of Ruth continues to tell us how these two women, Naomi and her daughter-in-law Ruth, come to the land of Israel, very, very embarrassed for how they left the land. And here they return, searching for food. Ruth comes across Boaz, who's a wealthy landowner. Ultimately, Boaz offers his hand in marriage. He offers a marriage to her, which she ultimately agrees to. And at the end of the book of Ruth, Boaz and Ruth marry. And here's the kicker. The very next morning, the morning after the wedding, Boaz is dead. Now, what's very mysterious about the story is that Boaz's marriage to Ruth was highly controversial. You see, the Torah tells us, we know that Ruth was a Moabite princess. The Torah tells us that a Moabite and an Ammonite are prohibited from converting to Judaism. They're not allowed to become Jewish. The reason is because when the Jewish people were leaving Egypt and they were on their way to the Promised Land, they reached out to the Moabites and the Ammonites, their distant cousins, for food and drink, bread and water, which they refused. And because of that awful refusal, the Torah prohibits us ever from allowing a Moabite or an Ammonite ever to become a Jew. When Boaz married Ruth, he did so with the explanation that when the Torah's prohibition of a Moabite converting to Judaism, it's only talking about male Moabites that are allowed to convert, that are forbidden to convert to Judaism, but female Moabites are allowed to convert to Judaism. And everybody was okay with that until the next morning when Boaz was dead. They said, oops, maybe it was not a good idea. Maybe it was not okay. And thus it was that nobody was quite sure if Ruth's marriage to Boaz was permissible or not. As it happens, the Megillah, the story of Ruth, concludes that Ruth is pregnant. Though her husband is dead, she's pregnant with a son who becomes Oved. Oved gives birth to Jesse, Yishai, and Yishai ultimately gives birth to David, his youngest son. 4 generations later, the story continues. When Jesse, Yishai, a very righteous man about whom the Torah tells us was one of 4 individuals in the history of the world who never sinned. Jesse was one of these people who never ever sinned. Here he was, and he realizes he had 7 sons at that time. He realizes, he turns to his wife Nitzevet, and he says to her, you know, I wonder if I'm truly a Jew. I wonder if I'm allowed, if maybe my great-grandmother Ruth was not really Jewish, if maybe she was prohibited from converting to Judaism. Maybe Ruth was not legally Jewish, which means I'm not legally Jewish, and therefore I'm not allowed to be married to you. What he does is, in an interesting law of Torah, he releases his Canaanite servant, and he marries her. He marries the servant. But he separates from his wife, from Nitzevet. As it happened in an interesting story, the servant that he married was a very righteous woman, and she allowed Nitzevet, the real wife, to switch in the middle of the night. It was dark. And Jesse didn't even know that he was actually sleeping now with his real wife, with Nitzevet, instead of the new wife, the released maidservant. And so it was a few months later, when Nitzevet is discovered to be pregnant, Jesse was convinced that she had been promiscuous and that the child was a mamzer. The child was a bastard. Remember, she was still married, just separated. He didn't realize that he actually was the father of this young child. And when David was born red-haired and short, Jesse, his father, banished him as an embarrassment to the family. He sent him out to the fields. And indeed, King David writes in the book of Psalms, in Psalm 69, he says, Muzar ha'iti le'echai, I was a stranger to my brothers. V'nochri, and foreign, livnei imi, to the sons of my mother. Because Nitzevet never revealed the reason, never revealed the secret to anyone in her family, not even to her own husband, that David was a legitimate child of Jesse. And so it was that David lived much of his early life as an outcast, as someone that was an embarrassment to most of his family. When King Saul, the first king of Israel, was waging war against the Philistines, and the Philistines sent their star soldier Goliath to challenge the Jews to a duel. It was David, young David, who was inspired to take on the challenge to represent his people. And indeed, we know the story. When David fought against Goliath, David and Goliath were cousins, we know, because David's great-grandmother was Ruth. Goliath's great-grandmother was Orpah, who were sisters. David, obviously, in the famous story, manages to overwhelm Goliath, and the Jews are victorious over the Philistines. King Saul now turns to his advisor, to Doeg, and he says, tell me, Ben mi zehanar, whose son is this David? King Saul started to get very concerned as he heard the masses, the women calling out that Saul has conquered thousands, but David has conquered tens of thousands. Saul started to realize, he started to sense that his days were numbered and that David was going to somehow take over his place. He turns to his advisor and he asks him, he says, whose lineage is David from? Now, Saul knew David already. David was already a performer. He would play the harp in front of Saul to calm his nerves already. Saul knew who David was. He knew that he was from the tribe of Judah. But he wanted to know which family in the tribe of Judah. Was he from the family of Peretz, which is the line of Jewish kings? Or was he from the family of Zerach, which is the line of Jewish noblemen? If he would be from Peretz, then Saul had reason to be afraid that he was maybe going to take the throne from him. But if he was from the line of Zerach, he wouldn't have to worry. And here Doeg says to him, Your Majesty, my king, instead of asking me which kind of Jew, what is the Jewish heritage of David, ask me rather if he's Jewish at all. And here Doeg, who was a brilliant scholar, tells Saul about the Moabite great-grandmother of David. He says that the Torah prohibits a Moabite, the Torah in Devarim, in Deuteronomy, prohibits a Moabite from converting into Judaism altogether. David's father's mother was a non-Jew, was a Moabite, and therefore an illegitimate Jew. Thus, David is himself not a legitimate Jew. The case was brought to the Beth Din, and the Talmud tells us that a scholar by the name of Amasa ben Yetel stands up as they were just about to declare David as a disqualified Jew, as a non-Jew. They were about to declare David as a non-Jew. Amasa ben Yetel stands up and he dramatically declares, he pulls out his sword like a Ishmaelite, and he declares, anybody who disqualifies David from his rightful lineage shall be stabbed with the sword. So have I received this teaching from the Beth Din of Samuel the prophet. What Amasa ben Yetel was saying is that the oral Torah explains the teaching of the written Torah. An oral tradition that dates back, that was received through Samuel the prophet, which dates it all the way back to Moses on Mount Sinai, explains the biblical verse, whereas the biblical verse says simply that a Moabite cannot convert to Judaism. It makes no distinction about gender. The oral tradition received from Moses on Mount Sinai makes it clear that it's only a male Moabite who may not convert, but a female Moabite is indeed allowed to convert. And thus, it was ruled that David was indeed a legitimate Jew. The Vilna Gaon explains to us that King David speaks of this dramatic moment in the book of Psalms in chapter 119, verses 161 and 162. What David explains is, he says in that verse something, two adjacent verses, he says, Sorim redafuni chinam, ministers hounded me for no reason. Umidvaracha pachad libi, from your word my heart was afraid. King David refers to his fear of the written law, the written Torah, which seems to state explicitly that a Moabite may not convert to Judaism. The written law made David fearful because it made him realize that he wasn't a legitimate Jew. But the next verse reads, Sas anechi alim rasecha. I rejoice over your sayings, not your written words, but the oral Torah. I rejoice over your sayings, like one who finds great treasure. Here says the Vilna Gaon, he was referring not to the written Torah, but to the oral Torah, that indeed explains the meaning of the written Torah, that when it says in the written Torah that a Moabite may not convert to Judaism, it means only a male Moabite may not convert, but a female Moabite may indeed convert. And that's why David was so grateful in Psalms 119 when he says, thank you, God, that you gave us the written Torah, which legitimizes me as a Jew. And it is with this context that we can now understand the reason why Samuel the prophet wrote the book of Ruth, and why that book is so important that it needs to be included within the Tanakh, within the Torah. You see, Samuel knew, he understood that David's status as a Jew was in question, was in doubt. Even King Saul and the Beth Din of the time were just this close to declaring David as a non-Jew. For this reason, Samuel, who anointed David as king of Israel, needed to write the book of Ruth in order to verify and affirm David's lineage as a great-grandson of Ruth, the Moabite convert, so that this book be incorporated into the Torah, so that for all time it would be known that Ruth's conversion was endorsed by the Torah. Indeed, David is the ancestor of Mashiach, of our Redeemer, for whom we yearn each and every single moment of every single day. And there would be no continuity to Judaism if we were unable to believe in the scion of David, in the coming of Mashiach as a Jew. If David is not a Jew, then how could his scion, how could his descendant, his Redeemer, be legitimate? This is why Samuel wrote the book of Ruth, as to serve as a document of testimony to David's legitimacy as a Jew. Indeed, the author of Lecha Dodi, Reb Shlomo Alkabetz of Tzfat, he called the book of Ruth Shoresh Yishai, the root of Jesse. And this is the reason why we read the book of Ruth specifically on the festival of Shavuot. You see, Shavuot is the time when we celebrate God's gift to the Jewish people, when God gave us the Torah. But what did God give us? We know that God gave us the 10 Commandments, the 2 tablets of sapphire. We know that God gave us the 5 books of Moses, the written Torah. But some question whether or not God gave us the oral Torah as well. The Mishnah, the Talmud, what is collectively known as the Talmud, the explanation of the written law, was that also given to Moses at Mount Sinai? Or was that perhaps, as some might say, an invention of the rabbis later on? When we read the book of Ruth and Shavuot, we realize that the Torah the written Torah cannot be understood without the accompaniment of the oral Torah. Just like King David and the belief in the Mashiach, which is fundamental to Judaism, it's one of the 13 fundamental principles of our faith. The belief in the Mashiach cannot exist without the oral Torah explaining the written Torah. Like David's mysterious lineage that needed a guide to navigate it, the Torah also needs a guide, a coach. This is the oral Torah and the sages of Jewish history who carried this message. And that's the message of the reading of the book of Ruth and Shavuot, to tell us that there was not one but 2 Torahs that were given to us on Mount Sinai. Why else would Boaz have legitimately been able to marry Ruth, if not that the oral Torah was explaining that it's only male Moabites that are forbidden to convert to Judaism, but female Moabites are indeed allowed to convert to Judaism? Just like if you were trying to sell your business, or if you were trying to pass your business over to your child, You've worked 40, 50, 60 years to build this magnificent business, this entrepreneurial empire. Would you simply pass the business over by sending an email with all the operating manual documents? Of course you wouldn't do such a thing. You'd only be able to pass the business over by sending the operating manual together with yourself, your experience, your explanation, your contacts, and your coaching. Just like you wouldn't be able to become a doctor by taking a course over the internet. You need a guide, a doctor, a professor, a coach, somebody to show you the ropes, to explain to you the difference between a kidney and a pancreas. You need someone to explain to you what's going on. You can't just do this merely academically alone. You need a guide. So too with the written Torah. It would make no sense whatsoever for God to send us just a written document without any context. You shall bind them as a sign between your eyes, and upon your arms is the message that the Torah tells us about tefillin. We have no idea what the Torah is talking about. You shall rest on the Shabbos day. We don't have any clue what it means to rest. It's only when the oral Torah accompanies the written Torah hand in hand, both revealed in Mount Sinai, that we're able to understand the intent of the Word of God as conveyed to us in the written Torah. And that's the reason why we read the book of Ruth on Shavuot, to instill within us this fundamental understanding, the fundamental commitment not only to the written Torah, which is being celebrated on Shavuot, but also to the oral Torah, without which we can't even accept King David as a legitimate Jew, and certainly not his descendant, the Mashiach, fundamental to our faith. What's fascinating is that Shavuot celebrates our unconditional commitment not only to the written Torah, but also to the oral Torah through the book of Ruth, but also through its very identity. The festival of Shavuot is the only yontiv in the whole Torah about which we don't have an explicit date. Nowhere in the Torah does it tell us which day of the year is the festival of Shavuot. The Torah tells us that Shavuot is celebrated on the morrow of the Sabbath. From the morrow of the Sabbath you shall count 7 weeks, then you shall celebrate Shavuot. Bit of an enigmatic explanation as to how we reach the date of Shavuot. If you took the Torah on face value, on literal level, you'd say, what's the morrow of the Sabbath? Sabbath is Shabbos. The day after Shabbos is Sunday. It would mean that you'd count 7 weeks after Sunday. Which Sunday? I have no idea. But 7 weeks after a particular Sunday, that's when you celebrate Shavuot. It's only when you have the oral Torah, which tells us that the morrow of the Sabbath is not talking about the Sabbath, the 7th day of the week. It's talking about the day of rest, of Pesach, the first day of Pesach. Then we have to count 7 weeks from the day after the first day of Pesach. 7 weeks from the second day of Pesach, that's when you celebrate the festival of Shavuot. It's almost as if the Torah was giving us a hidden code to tell us that you cannot even locate the date of the giving of the Torah without the accompaniment of the oral Torah. We need the oral Torah to understand, to be able to identify the very observance of the festival of Shavuot. Because on Shavuot we celebrate not one but 2 Torahs, the giving of the written Torah, as well, the 5 books of Moses, as well as the giving of the Mishnah and the Talmud, and all of the rabbinic explanations of the written Torah. All of them together and collectively form the unbreakable word of God, for which we have to exhibit an unconditional commitment. What's fascinating even more is that by divine providence, the kings of Israel, the kings of the Davidic line, have their lineage embroiled through Ruth, a lineage which is subject to such extraordinary doubt and speculation. A lineage whose authenticity can only be verified, be authenticated by an unwavering commitment to the oral Torah. You see, in order to protect the Jewish kings from having their power corrupt them, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. But in order to protect the Jewish kings from abandoning the Torah built in the lineage of the Jewish kings of the Davidic line coming through Ruth the Moabite, so that if they would ever dare to reject the Torah, they would effectively be rejecting their own authenticity, their own identity as Jews. Because if you let go of the oral Torah, you're left only with the written Torah, and the written Torah denies Ruth being a Jew, and hence David is also not a legitimate king. In the words of Rabbi Soloveitchik, the Brisker Rav, passed away in Jerusalem in the late 50s. He says that God designed it in such a way that the kings of Israel would literally be held hostage, that if they ever strayed away from the oral Torah by abandoning it through their power, they would be abandoning their own identity as Jewish people. This, my friends, is the meaning of the book of Ruth, and its extraordinary power to teach us no specific law, as much as it teaches us the importance of the oral Torah and how we can never ever divorce the written Torah from the oral Torah. All of it was given to Moses and Mount Sinai, and we simply wouldn't be able to celebrate our identity as Jews, our commitment to David and Mashiach, without it. And that's why we celebrate it. We read this book on the festival of Shavuot. In closing, I'd just like to conclude with an inspirational realization. As you think of David and the extraordinary opposition that he experienced in his lifetime, which started 4 generations even before he was conceived, he was already facing such extraordinary challenges and struggle. We realize that when, just like David, experienced such great challenge because of the extraordinarily glorious destiny and future that he was to bring to this world, when you too face challenge, it means that what you're doing is important. Don't back down from the obstacles that stand in your path. Turn your struggles into springboards. Let the drawbacks in your life serve as the catapult that will propel you to destinations that you never dreamed possible. Thank you for joining me here tonight. I'm Rabbi David Vigler.